Welcome to Online Sydney Skeptics in the Pub for July. I'm Jessica Singer from Australian Skeptics and I will be hosting tonight. But more importantly, behind the scenes, making all of this work, we have Lara Benham and also Josh moderating. So thank you to Lara and thank you to Josh. If you haven't done so already, please hit the follow button so that you'll be notified whenever Australian Skeptics goes live on Twitch. Before we begin, Australian Skeptics would like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting tonight. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So we often get asked, how can I support Australian Skeptics? And I always say that a good start is to subscribe to our magazine, The Skeptic, which this year is celebrating 42 years of publication. You can get the digital or print edition. It's very easy. Go to our website, www.skeptics.com.au. Follow the links to magazine. You can also access back issues there. And I can see on the back cover, there is a reminder for this year's Australian Skeptics National Convention, which is being organised by our good friends, the Canberra Skeptics. And it will be on the weekend of the 26th and the 27th of November. So keep an eye out for further announcements about the convention. And now to our talk tonight. Our speaker is Roz Kaldor-Aroni. She is the founder of Elato Ice Cream. Roz studied applied chemistry and law. She's worked as a lawyer. She's been a manager at Telstra. More recently, she has been the CEO of the not-for-profit organisation Australia Israel Medical Research. But it is her hobby of ice cream making that has led to her current venture, Elato. And she will be sharing with us the science and secrets of ice cream. Now, as usual, we'll be taking questions at the end of the talk. You can submit questions via Slido. If you just type !Q into the chat room, it will bring up the link to Slido and you can go there and pose your question. So please join me in welcoming Roz Kaldor-Aroni.
So can I start now, Jessica? Can I start? Can you hear me? Okay, not sure what's going on. Can anyone hear me? Benny, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, so no one, I just want to hear anything. Okay, so I've just been told you can hear me. That's great. Apologies for that. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to have this time to talk to you all about ice cream. As you'll hear from my talk, I'm pretty passionate about it. Also know quite a bit about it. So I'm very excited to share all my knowledge with all of you, including some of the myths around it. So I'll just move to the next slide, what we're going to cover tonight. So the first part will be a bit of a lesson about the science behind ice cream. Then we're going to go straight into the myth busting about ice cream, things you may or may not understand or have some confusion about. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got into this whole area and became an expert. And then we're going to talk about the differences between all the different types of ice cream. And there are some significant differences, which I'll explain to you. And then there's a little section which Jessica was excited about, which is that I've, in my developing product, have had lots of issues in manufacturing and taking small scale product through to large scale manufacturing. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, I'm going to let you into some really exciting secrets on how to improve ice cream making at home. And I don't know why, but no one tells you these things that I have learned on my travels and in my education as an ice cream maker, and they should. So I'm going to share it with you, plus a recipe as well, a very simple recipe that I think you'll really enjoy. So that's what we're going to cover. And obviously, I'd love to hear your questions at the end. Particularly if you're listening hard and you've got some tough questions, I'm all up for it. So move to the first slide, which is about ice cream science. So please don't feel overwhelmed. I'm going to take you through this slowly, but you do need to understand that ice cream is quite complicated. That's why I love it, because I'm a scientist by training, and getting under the hood was really part of the attraction. So we'll start with point one, which is the importance of sugar. Sugar is key to ice cream, and that is actually why sugar-free ice creams don't taste so great. Because there isn't anything that can do what sugar can do in ice cream. And what it does is it basically blocks the water molecules from finding each other and creating an ice block structure. So at the one extreme, you've got obviously no sugar, you've got a hard ice block. So you've got water molecules in a lattice holding each other tight. At the other extreme, if you take jam or honey and you put it in the freezer, you'll find even when it's frozen, it's quite gooey. It's not hard. And that's because the sugar molecules, of which there are a lot, there's about 80% sugar in honey and about 50% sugar in jam. They get in between the water and they prevent the water molecules from finding each other and creating a structure. And so ice cream, if you like, is somewhere in the middle. It's firm, but it's not runny. And those water molecules are basically managed and put under control by the presence of sugar, as well as I'm going to also explain fat and proteins as well. And so that's what ice cream is all about. It's about, and as is any frozen dessert product, it's about managing the way the water reacts to the rest of the ingredients in the ice cream. And that's complicated because in addition to the structural impact of sugar, you've also got a couple other things happening. That sugar also, the amount of sugar impacts the sweetness, and obviously that's relevant for taste. And in addition to that, that impact on the water also impacts the freezing temperature of the product and how firm it is when it's frozen. And that's all physics and maths. And that's part of the attraction of this area for me, is actually a bit of a maths whiz. And so the more maths I can do in this area, the more I love it. So as you can see, there's a lot going on. So now we're going to move over to the little drawing. And I don't have a pointer. Actually, maybe I do. Yes. I don't know if you can see that. But I'm looking at the item which says freeze, concentrate, unfrozen phase of sugar, salts, and proteins. Essentially, that's water with sugar dissolved into it. That's sort of one part of the many part system we have in ice cream. Then the bad guys are these grey things. That's the water molecules. When I say bad guys, basically the idea in ice cream is you try and keep them away from each other. So you can see in between in that drawing, you've got these big white holes, which are air bubbles, which are an important part of ice cream and gives it a fantastic mouthfeel. You've also got little protein, fat globules, I should say, which obviously fat also impacts mouthfeel. And then in these little ones here are called protein, micelles, which are casein micelles, which are little bits of protein. And then on top of that, you've also got this little one here, which is it's basically a fat globule, and it's got protein sitting around it as well as emulsifier. And that's the emulsifier, in fact, is what makes the water and the fat and the proteins all work together. So you have to have emulsifier in there to have that whole beautiful connection happening, which again impacts mouthfeel. So you can see it's pretty, there's a lot going on, but the key to it is getting these water molecules apart, so having lots of stuff in between. And the next part is how you handle the fats. So fat is really important in ice cream because it enables the air to get encapsulated. So the air is actually surrounded by fat when it's in ice cream. And to get the fat in a suitable form so it can actually cover the air when it's being frozen, because actually when you freeze ice cream, it's being whipped, whether it's in the factory with a huge barrel that has air pumping through it, or whether it's being whipped with a beating a device, it's still air that's going in. And so the comparison I make in my slide is I've got butter, which is solid fat with a bit of water in between. Obviously, butter has a bit of water in it. And then you compare that with whipped cream, which is whipped up with air. And obviously, the consistency is completely different. But the whipped cream is full of air. And that's because, again, the fats and the proteins are going around those air bubbles and creating the ability to have the air encapsulated. And that's what's happening in ice cream. Now, to get that fat to do what you need it to do, you can't just leave it the way it is in cream or in milk. It won't do what it has to do. You have to do another step, which some of you may be aware of in milk production. It's called homogenization. And what that is basically you take the fats and you put it through these teeny weeny holes under pressure. And essentially what that does, it smashes the fats into smithereens, into tiny little unstable molecules. And so unstable, they really want to come back together. And so that's what we do in the factory is once the recipe is cooked, and I also do this at home, then it gets homogenized. And at home, I use a Thermomix at full blast for a couple of minutes to really blast the fats into submission. And in the factory, we use a proper homogenizer, the same as they do in dairies. And so then what happens, which is really important, and you'll hear about this later as well, is the fats then need to have time to come back together in an unstable format, and that's called aging. And so in every factory, and in fact in all my recipes, every good ice cream recipe should get you to age overnight, because that gives the fats time to come together in an unstable way, but enough so that when the air comes in, it can encapsulate the air in a way that gives you a beautiful mouthfeel. So then the next part about ice cream is you've got to have them in the right proportions: the water, the sugar, the fat, the proteins, and mineral salts. They all have to be in the correct proportions, and I'm going to show some of how that works in a few slides. And if it is in the right proportion, so basically, essentially it's 40% or so or less solids and 60% water. And within those solids, the sugar ranges from 16 to 20, or actually in sorbet, it's 32% sugar. And then you've got proteins and other things. But those proportions are pretty fixed. And that's the maths, because I do use a massive spreadsheet where everything is done with mathematical relationships based on those proportions. And the joy of this, which is why I got excited about ice cream, is I can take a 1 litre or even a half a litre recipe at home, and you'll see soon a little video of how small my machine is. And because it's all based in physics and chemistry and maths, I can multiply 1 litre recipe or a half a litre recipe up to 2,000 litres, and that recipe will still work perfectly in the factory. And that's quite mind-blowing when you think about it. Now, there are limits, which I'll also explain, because there are still physical limits on what you can do at scale. But theoretically, my recipe works perfectly every time, subject to the physical limits within the factory. And on top of all of that, you need to have an emulsifier. Now, in Elato, which is a beautiful, clean product, we use egg yolk for our dairy products, and we use, just recently switched from sunflower lecithin, which unfortunately, thanks to Ukraine making most of the world's sunflower lecithin, the price went from $500 a kilo to $1,500 a kilo overnight. And so now we switched to acacia gum, which is actually performing quite well. That's for the vegan. So you use an emulsifier, and that helps you get those fats and the waters working together in a way that's nice and smooth and creamy. And then the final thing is we also use gums, which are essentially like gels, because in that water phase, you need it all to hold together, particularly in the case of my product, which is sold in supermarkets and transported from shop to home. You need it to hold together, A, not melt, and B, not to fall apart. And so that gel base in the water holds everything together. So that's kind of the basic parts of ice cream. So I'm going to move to the next slide, which is let's get into the juicy stuff. Let's go into the urban myths. So the first one, and you might have others you want to ask me about, is this, everyone always says gelato is amazing, it's fresh, they don't use chemicals. And so there's always this tug of war between which is better, gelato or ice cream. And I'm going to go and explain actually what those differences are as well. So occasionally it's true that they use fresh ingredients and not many of them use chemicals, but mostly it's not true, because ice cream shops are, labor is expensive, time is costly, and frankly, ingredients are costly, particularly fresh ones. And so to save all of those costs, what they do is they use pre-made pastes and pre-mixed powders, and those powders contain quite a lot of chemicals, and they're chemical emulsifiers and chemical stabilizers, and they're not necessarily clean products. Now, not all of them do that, and I can't even tell you who does and who doesn't, but if you're interested, you should ask your local gelato shop whether they're using pastes, whether they're using pre-mixed powders, and the pre-mixed powder, for example, is called base 50. Everything's pre-mixed into it, so all they do is just measure it. They don't have to mix themselves. And it's only the true artisan gelato makers who unbundle all that and unpack it all and use all their own individual ingredients. And also obviously spend the time and money getting fresh ingredients as well. Now, that's not to say it's not a beautiful product. Gelato tastes fantastic. And for the reasons we'll move on and I'll explain later, we'll understand kind of what the differences are and why the taste is a bit different in a good way. But if you're looking for a beautiful, fresh product, you need to ask your supplier, the gelato shop where you go, how they make their product. And hopefully they'll be honest. So that's the first one. Is it's very rare that some of the ones I know Peter Pippo talks about her fresh ingredients. So if you ask her, I'm sure she'll say she does. That's in Melbourne for anyone who's not in Melbourne. But the others, you just have to ask them. I'm not going to comment on whether they do or they don't. So next myth, creaminess. Does that come from fat? Well, yes and no. I'll give you an example of something that's really interesting. A friend of mine told me that she discovered a brand new ice cream and she just could not believe how deliciously creamy it was. And she said, it's even creamier than my ice cream. To which I said, not so sure about that. And then I had a look at the ingredients and it had less fat than mine does. But it had 120% air. So that's the other thing about ice cream, which I'll explain in a couple of slides, is that it does contain, as we explained, air, and the I suppose I can only describe them as cheaper ice creams have a lot of air. So they have about 120% air. Blue Ribbon and Buller Creamy Classic all have 120% air. And the one that my friend was describing also had 120% air. And that gives you the mouth feel of creaminess. And that is one of the reasons why it's used. Also, it's used because it's free and it makes the product cheaper. Interestingly, it also lowers the total calorie count, because if you've got mainly air in your product, you don't have much ingredients with calories. So it's possible that the ice cream you've got has a high fat content, but more than likely it isn't. It's coming from the air in the product. And so a high fat content would be something like Haagen-Dazs, which has up to 14% fat. They call it a super premium ice cream because of the high fat levels. But Buller and Blue Ribbon all have around 10%. In fact, in Australia and most countries, you cannot call it ice cream unless it has 10% milk fat. So they all have around 10%. Just if you're interested, look on pack next time. And the other way you tell how much air is in it is by the weight per serve. And generally, the 120% air ones have a weight per serve around 45 or 50 grams. And gelato, for example, which has about 30% air, sits probably around 70, 75 grams per serve. And in the case of Elato, we sit around 66, 67%, slightly more air. So that's the story about air in ice cream. So then this is another little interesting myth, which is an interesting one, and that is one of the reasons that people love ice cream and gelato potentially is because it has very similar fat and sugar levels to breast milk, because obviously that's a food that you feel very nurtured by. obviously you have it in your early, formative days, and obviously it has, a very strong connection. And so gelato, interestingly, has pretty similar values to breast milk of sugar and fat. Basically, gelato has double the sugar to the fat content, and that's pretty similar to breast milk. Ice cream has more of a similar equal sort of fat to sugar ratio, so it's a little bit away, but certainly gelato definitely has that connection. So that if you're wondering why you feel a huge amount of satisfaction when you eat ice cream, particularly licking ice cream, I think that is incredibly nurturing. That is the reason. So next one, ice cream tastes better the more you eat it. That's a complete misnomer. What's really happening is that your tongue and your taste buds only operate effectively between the temperatures of room temperature and around 50 degrees C. So sort of, warm to hot. Above that, basically your tongue stops working and you kind of burn your tongue. Below that, it definitely stops working. You just don't taste anymore. Plus, you also cannot warm the product in your mouth to get the aromatic smells and flavors up your nose when it's cold. So what happens with ice cream, which is pretty bizarre, and most of you will realize this when I explain it, the first taste you get is the best possible taste because your mouth is at room temperature. You get your first taste, it warms up, goes up your nose, and it's heaven. After that, your tongue and your taste buds are out of commission. You don't necessarily taste anything after that. You're hanging on to that memory of what you just tasted and you're thinking, how can I get that back? It's dissipated, it's gone. And of course, the reason it's gone is because your mouth is frozen and you are neither heating the product in your mouth and getting it into sort of up your nose and getting those beautiful aromats, and your taste buds are not working. So the more you eat, the less your taste buds are going to work, and that drives you to have more. So if you've ever wondered why you're being driven to eat ice cream, it's because you're seeking that, well, I'm suggesting to you, you are seeking that elusive taste that disappeared after the first mouthful. Now, there is a way to get it back. What I recommend is that you have a cup of warm water from the tap, not hot, next to you while you're eating your ice cream. Have your first mouthful, and then you rinse with warm water or even a cup of tea, but not hot, warm, and you bring your taste buds back down to room temperature. You can feel when you have, it's a very weird sensation when you take your ice cream and then you add your warm water or your hot warm tea, and you just feel your tongue suddenly go, ooh, it got warm again. And the way you test if your mouth is fully back to room temperature is you put your tongue on the roof of your mouth, and if it's the same temperature, your tongue on the roof of your mouth, you are good to go with your next mouthful. Now, you're probably not going to want to do that, but I'm suggesting if you really want to get the most out of your ice cream eating experience, that is the best way to do it. And, I've even had little cups made for people, which aren't necessarily for sale yet, but will be in the future, to enable you to do it. So I have one of these cups that keep the water warm. So, highly recommend it when you're eating ice cream, unless you're just basically happy to have frozen taste buds, and that's entirely up to you. So number 5, you'll never be able to make ice cream at home as good as in the shops. Definitely not true. When I've explained to you my tips, I have made at home using a very, very basic machine, not my rah-rah restaurant machine. Ice cream is as good as I can buy in the shops, and you just have to know what you're doing, and I'm going to explain that all to you by the end of the session. And the last one is health star ratings. Is it an accurate measure of a healthier product? Well, the statement is it is an accurate measure of a healthier product. Now, it's very interesting about health star ratings, slightly controversial. It was all set up by cereal manufacturers, and so the way in which they measure health rating is all about cereal. Now, the rest of us are stuck with that system, and we use it the best way we can, and you'll see with Elato I've used it to my advantage. But it's very out of date because it does give demerit points for sugars and salts and saturated fats, but it gives very heavy demerit points for saturated fat and less demerit points for sugar. And that's because the cereal guys, they don't care about saturated fat. They don't have fat in their product, but they do care about sugar. So that the sugar demerits are very low because that means their rating is better. And the fat demerits, and we know that fats aren't necessarily the enemy anymore, sugar is. The fat demerits are much bigger. And so on the point system, it takes that, it drops you down quite a bit. And as I said, the cereal guys don't really care about that. And so my spin on all that is it's a bit out of date. It is what it is. And every time they want to change it, there's this huge lobbying, and it's very political, and as you can imagine, because a lot of the cereal guys live and die on these health star ratings. And even Woolworths, who we sell through, are very excited by these health star ratings because that's all we've got. And so, there's a lot of pressure as a supplier to give good health star ratings, even though the system's quite out of date. So there'll be other myths you can bring up during question time, but they're just some of the ones I wanted to explain to you. So now, how did I get into ice cream? So it all started about 10 years ago. My husband bought me a recipe book, and at the back it was all maths, and I couldn't believe it. I just thought, oh my God, there's a food where I can use maths. I'm in heaven. And then I realized that maths was so sophisticated that, as I explained to you, a 1 litre recipe can be have zeros added to it and still work at scale. And that was completely mind-blowing for me. And so it just was something I felt I needed to know more about. And so mine is the classic story of a hobby becoming a passion, becoming a business. So there was a point at which I started to feel like it was becoming something more than just a hobby. I sat down with my husband. That's him in the picture. He's listening, so he's going to be grumpy that I use that picture, but never mind. And I said, look, I think, it's time. I really think I know enough now about ice cream, and I really want to pursue this because I know so much and I'm still loving it. And
Your slide hasn't changed.
oh, my slide hasn't changed. Ooh, that's weird. Okay, sorry, my husband just told me my slide hasn't changed. Let me go back.
It's absolutely fine at this end.
Oh, it is fine?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So it says my passion for ice cream.
It
Great.
does.
Excellent. Sorry, let me keep going. He must have had a time delay. So I basically said, look, if we're going to do this, I want to use it and leverage it to be a social enterprise so I can use my knowledge and skills to give back, because we're both very committed to philanthropy, and I saw this as a great way of leveraging my knowledge and skills. I won't bore you with the process I went through to kind of work out how I was going to do this, but the result was that we set up a for-profit company where half of our profits are being gifted to Oz Harvest, and they have been a sensational partner. And those of you who are overseas, Oz Harvest are a food security organisation who take food that would otherwise be thrown out, they repurpose it, and they feed people who are in need. Amongst other things, they do many other things, but that's their key activity. So that's been very, very rewarding. I mean, it's early days for us, but that's what's really driving me is the more successful my business, the more we'll be able to gift to Oz Harvest, and that's very motivating for me. So it's not just the ice cream, it's also the fact that I can give back as well. So then basically between 2015 and 2019, I just sort of kept on pushing myself to learn more. Started with an online course through the gelato people in Bologna in Italy who are called Cappagiani Gelato University. Ended up, they have a class here in Melbourne where they have someone who trained in Italy who now teaches here. But then I finished off my training in gelato in Bologna at the university. But still it wasn't enough, because I discovered, which I hadn't realized before, that gelato has significantly more sugar than ice cream does. And I'll explain in the next couple of slides why. And that really upset me, because sugar really is the enemy these days. And the opposite to that, gelato has less fat and ice cream has more fat, but fat is not the enemy, it's sugar. And I suddenly realized that this was not what I wanted to do. I did not want to do gelato, and I realized that I really needed to know more about ice cream making, which is quite different. And I'll explain that in another couple of slides in terms of the actual process of making it. And so I took myself off to Guelph in Canada, which is where the leading academic in ice cream takes a masterclass. And that's where I learned everything about manufacturing ice cream, including Elato was basically put together while I was there in Canada. And I'll explain more about Elato in a minute. So all the way through, I was always trying to create a healthier product. That was part of my interest. And that meant no chemicals, a clean product, which interestingly is quite challenging because most of the cheap and very effective products they use to make ice cream and gelato are chemicals. So that's been part of the challenge. But I was up to the task, and I'll explain a bit more about the product, and you'll see that I've achieved quite a lot in that clean space. And so we launched in November of last year. And so far we're in 400 stores, a whole lot of about 300 plus independent stores, and about 90 Woolies Metro, and soon hopefully be in many more stores. And we're getting great feedback on the product. So I'm just going to show you. This is my 1 litre machine at home. As you can see, it's tiny. Well, you can't really, there's no sense of proportion there, but it's small. And I use all my recipes are tested in that machine. And when they run perfectly on that machine, they run perfectly in the factory, which is pretty mind-blowing. So I'll go to the next slide. No, it's not doing that. Here we go. So I won't spend much time. This is more about Elato, what we achieved. I'm only going to point out a few things. The clean label part, which means not only we not have colours, flavours, chemicals or preservatives, but all of our ingredients are extracted without any chemical processing at all. Very obsessive about that. We also are nothing else, Australian owned and made. Obviously, we're giving to Oz Harvest. And then with the dairy, we've actually got a granted patent, which was part of the work I did in Canada. And that's because our dairy flavours are lactose-free. And lactose-free milk and cream, as I discovered in Canada, and some of you might know, is significantly sweeter than normal milk and cream. And that's because there's the sugar lactose has got 2 sugars joined together, glucose and galactose. And when it's lactose-free, all that happens is an enzyme called lactase, which is found in your gut. And some people don't have that enzyme, which is why they're lactose intolerant. But that enzyme splits the 2 sugars into 2 single parts. Excuse me. And when they're separate, they are 3 times sweeter than when they're together. So I take that extra sweetness and I use 30% less added sugar as a result, because I don't need that sweetness because I've already got it from my starting ingredients. And that allows me to make a 30% less added sugar claim. And then in addition to that, I now have less solids than I would otherwise have had because I've got less sugar. I need to have this 40% solids to make the product work. And so we add prebiotic fibre, which is great for your gut. And no one else has done that prior to me in Australia anyway, and we've got a granted patent for that. We also get a 3-star health rating because we've offset the fats and the sugars with fibre and also a significant level of protein as well. Not enough to make a protein claim, but enough to get me a 3-star health rating. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we've done that. And we're the only indulgent ice cream in the market to have a 3-star health rating. On the vegan side, more challenging because with vegan, you have very high levels of saturated fats. We use a coconut cream base for our chocolate. Unavoidable, it's got high saturated fats. And that is one of the issues with vegan products in ice cream anyway, is that the non-animal fats are all high in saturated fats. It makes it hard to get a good health star rating because, as we know, I've explained, the fats are very heavily penalised in that system, and you really can't compensate it with enough fibre and protein to get the score up. So that's our product. Tastes amazing. We've got some awards as well, which I'll have to speed through now. I'm going to be very quick here because we're running. I don't want to spend too much time on talking just about my product. But we have 3 flavours. We call triple vanilla, cold brew, decaf, cafe latte. They're our dairy flavours. And we went decaf, so you can eat it at night. And the chocolate is the vegan. But in addition to everything else we're doing, which is a lot, I'm also really passionate about using flavour suppliers who are also committed to giving back. So the vanilla comes from Halala. They set up the vanilla industry in Tonga. They're very committed to their local community, and they give back a lot to schools and hospitals there. The coffee comes from Change Coffee, who are owned by World Vision. They are a for-profit which are owned by World Vision. That's their social enterprise. They do a beautiful product, and their decaf is unbelievably good. I don't compromise when I use these people because their flavours are unbelievable. And then the chocolate comes from the Solomon Islands, from an Australian family that set up the industry there, who are also committed to giving back to the local community. So that's a very strong part of the brand, and very passionate about that. And they're incredible collaborators, and they've been a joy to work with. So then, very fortunate that in this short time that we've been on the market, we've done really well from our peers. So we've had 4 silver medals in both, 2 silver in the Victorian and 2 silver in the national competition for both our vanilla and our cold brew, which are our dairy products. And then there isn't really an equivalent award for vegan yet. We'll see if that's going to eventuate sometime. But on the giving back side, we also got a really amazing award from Naturally Good, which is a big expo that ran in Sydney in June, I should say. And we got the best socially conscious brand as a result of all the work we're doing in that space. So that was hugely validating. And then just to give you an idea about how impactful Oz Harvest is, we're very interested in supporting United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as SDGs. And the work that Oz Harvest does is very significant in that space. So obviously they're dealing with hunger, they support education, obviously their repurposing of food helps with consumption. They also, by repurposing food, there's less methane in rubbish dumps, so they help climate action, and they're obviously very, very keen on partnering. So it's a significant organisation that I'm very happy to support. So this is, I'm not going to go into this slide, just really more to show you that we've got many features, as I've already described. And if you look on the green ticks, there are 13 of them. It's probably hard to see all of that. And our competitors don't really have many ticks. The ones that come closest is Chili's at 7 ticks and Donata at 7 ticks, and that's because they're better for you products. So some of the better for you measurements that I have there, they also get. But we're a very highly featured product, and if you're looking for features, then Elato is, what I would recommend that you try. So I'll just keep moving. So this is a bit overwhelming. I'm going to go through it slowly, not that I have that much time. So it's very interesting to observe here how this health star rating system works when you compare. So if we start at the top, vegan frozen desserts, as I mentioned to you, non-animal fats are high in saturated fat, and in the health star system, it's very penalising. So most of the vegan ice creams, we're talking about proper ice creams, like for example, what we make, not the ones that have got artificial sugars or sweeteners, very, very low scoring on health star rating, because they're very high in fat and normally quite high in sugar as well. So pushes you off this, down to the lower end of the scale. They typically obviously have they're low in proteins, and they're also normally have limited air because structurally it's challenging to get a lot of air into those products. Ice cream, in terms of sugar, and we compare it with gelato, much less sugar, but more fat compared with gelato. Milk solids, not that different. And star rating, ice cream, the connoisseur vanillas for people overseas, it's a very well-known vanilla here, probably equivalent to Haagen-Dazs. Haagen-Dazs as well, probably 2-star rated. And gelato, because it has less fat and the fat doesn't demerit you as much, it has 2.5 stars. Now, Elato, we're proud of our 3 stars because what we've done is we've offset, well, first of all, we've got less sugar. We're going at the lower end, which helps with the rating. Our fat, even though it's 13%, we're quite low in saturated fats. And we compensate that with by having a high level of protein and fiber, and that's how we get our 3-star health rating. And we're the only, as I've said before, we're the only indulgent ice cream that has that rating. And we say basically we have all these better for you features, and you would never know when you eat the product because it tastes as good as any other indulgent ice cream with a lower health rating. So if that's what you're looking for, highly recommend you try my product. And then if we just keep going down with frozen yogurt, also 3-star health rated because the fats are low. Low sugar ice cream, to compensate for not having enough sugar, they put more fat. So even though it's got less sugar, it doesn't do that well in the ratings. Sorbet, interestingly, gets up to a 3.5 rating because it has no fat. It's just fruit and water, but very high in sugar, 24 to 32%. And again, because it's a cereal-based system for cereals, for breakfast cereals, they don't care about the impact of sugar. And so the sugar doesn't give you a low score. And I would argue that it probably should, but it doesn't. Granita, similar. Granita is basically like a sorbet, but a lot less sugar. Similar rating, even though it has a lot less sugar. And then low-fat ice cream does the best because obviously the fats are the ones that give you the demerits. So if you have less fat, you're going to do better. And obviously low-fat ice cream also tends to have a bit lower sugar. So so then we're looking at the difference between ice cream and gelato. The takeaway really is ice cream has less sugar, more fat. Gelato is the opposite, more sugar, less fat. So you make your decision about what you're looking for. Also, the air is different. Ice cream tends to have a lot more air and gelato less air. And so it's much more dense, dense on your palate, and also more calories, less air. So I'll leave that up to you guys to decide where you sit on those choices. So then the next slide, we're talking about manufacturing, and we're almost towards the end of my slides. So get your questions ready. So this is Jessica's request. So even though in theory you can scale up the recipe and it works perfectly, there are physical limits, and the ones that I've come across which have been interesting is if the fluid is really thick, it has to go from a big tank into a machine, into the churn. If it's too thick, the pumps aren't designed to handle thickness, and so you just can't get the product in. So at home, I can take my container and I can tip it into my churn, and I don't have any pumping issues. So one of the first issues I had was I learned that thick product doesn't work. So I have to change my recipes so that I avoid that problem. Steep learning curve for me, because before I went to my manufacturer, I knew nothing about manufacturing. I knew a lot about making recipes, but not about manufacturing. And then the other part that's challenging is moving bits in fluids. First of all, homogenization. You can't have any bits in there because it's going through tiny holes. When you churn, the churn has a limit on what it can handle. It's a very finely tuned machine, so any bits in there, it freaks out. When you're making ripples in ice cream, the ripple feeders don't handle bits very well. And then there is a special machine that does chunks, but it's again complicated because to move chunks through fluid is a very complex machinery activity. So very challenging in the space, much more challenging than I ever imagined was possible. I'm just going to show you a video, which is showing you the filling in the factory, if it's going to work. Here we go. And I mean, obviously, you can see it's complex machinery, and that's coming straight out of the churn and into the feeder and then into the tubs. And that's my product. That's my chocolate product being filled. So then I think we're on to our last slide. So here's the good stuff to finish. This is going to make your ice cream making at home much, much better. So the first thing, this applies to both whether you're making ice cream or gelato. And when you're looking at your recipe, the difference is really based on the amount of fat. So if it says it's an ice cream, but it seems to not have much fat and has a lot of sugar, it's probably more likely to be a gelato, and vice versa. So basically, as I've explained, low sugar, higher fat is ice cream, and vice versa is gelato. But for either way, these next 3 items apply. So as I mentioned at the beginning, when you make your product and your fats have been smashed, which I think I've only mentioned in the ice cream section, yes. In gelato, it doesn't really have enough fat to benefit from homogenization and fat destabilization. So that's why I've left it for ice cream only. But either way, you still need to let it age overnight. It makes a huge difference to your product the next day and how it tastes and how it works. That's not in any recipes that I've seen. Even my first ice cream book that my husband bought me didn't say that, but it's really important. And the minimum amount of time you have to leave it is 4 hours. If you're using one of those churns that's got a big ice block, don't make a 1 litre recipe because your ice block will melt before your product gets hard. So the maximum volume you should be using is 500 mils. Even if the recipes that come with the machine says 1 litre, don't believe them because you're just not going to get a great product. And the final thing is that guar gum is a really fantastic and easily accessible gum, which creates a really nice structure in your ice cream. So even if there's no guar gum in your recipe, you should considering basically it's 0.1% of your total volume is the sort of recommended amount for guar gum. You could go up to 0.2%. So if it's not in your recipes, you should buy it and you should start using it, but obviously very, very tiny amounts. So in the recipe below, I've got 1/8 of a teaspoon. That's how little you use, because as I said, it's 0.1%. And then if we go to the ice cream only ones, there's 2, obviously. The first is, as I've said already, to homogenize your product, which will make the finished product so much better. You smash your proteins and your fats to smithereens in a blender or in a food processor at high for 2 minutes. Just make sure it doesn't spill everywhere. So you obviously can't have too much in your food processor or your blender. But, if you do that, it will hugely improve the quality of the churned product. And then the other thing is for ice cream, you need speed to get the air in because you've created this beautiful product with high fat, with the fats have been smashed to smithereens, and they're ready to take air. So it would be a shame not to give that ice cream the air that it needs to give it that beautiful, fluffy, and light texture. And so if you've got a churn that's got variable beating, so I've put a picture there of a KitchenAid one where you can adjust the beating speed, you need to physically count revolutions per minute, and 90 revolutions per minute is what you need as a minimum to get that air into that product. And if you do that, your ice cream will be sensational. I've actually got a very cheap ice cream maker with a frozen base on it, and it has 2 speeds, and the top speed is 90, and so that's what I use to make ice cream, and I've made fantastic products with that. So take all those away and try them, and obviously happy to hear your feedback whether they worked or not, but that will give you hugely improved product. And as I said, I've never seen many of these comments in recipes anywhere. So finally, I'm not so sure whether you want to take a screenshot or whether this is available. I'm not going to run through the recipe other than to say it's a pretty simple lemon sorbet or granita recipe. Basically, it doesn't have a lot of measurements in it. 2 to 3 lemons to get, because you've got to get at least a 500 ml volume, mainly because you won't be able to measure a small amount of guar gum. So if you have 500 mils, you get about the right amount at 1/8 of a teaspoon. Maya lemons, if you've ever tried them, are the most amazing in lemon sorbet. They don't have a bitter aftertaste. They're slightly sweet, and someone gave me some recently. I made my first lemon sorbet with them, and it was just out of this world. So lemon juice, caster sugar, water, and guar gum, that's it. You measure the volume of lemon juice, and basically I said if it's less than 180 mils, then you need to use less guar gum, even less than 1/8 of a teaspoon. You then take the volume of lemon juice, you measure how much is there in a jug, and then you add the same amount of water. And then let's say it's 200 mils, you then add 200 grams of sugar, and that's your recipe. That's it. So you don't, it's completely flexible based on the amount of lemon juice you start with. That tells you what the recipe is going to be. You add your guar gum, you mix until the sugar is dissolved. You're using caster sugar, you don't even need to heat it, just mix it, and then you churn it, freeze it, and it will be sensational. The other variation is if you want to do a granita, which is basically like an ice block, which you use a fork to scrape and make into a sort of icy, crunchy thing, then you would just half the amount of sugar, and that will then enable you to do a granita instead. And then you don't need a churn. And then you're making this sort of slushy kind of crunchy lemony thing, which the Italians call granita. So enjoy that recipe. Be great if I can hear back whether anyone tried it, whether it worked, whether it didn't work. It is very simple and I highly recommend it. So that was basically the end of what I had to tell you all about. I know I haven't left a huge amount of time for questions, but I'm open to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Roz. That was amazing.
So I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay, so I can see people and see. Is that okay?
Yep.
Oh, how can I see what's going on here? I'll just escape. Okay. Very good. So what's the first question?
Okay. Everybody's very, very intrigued about the 120% air measurement.
Yep.
Can you explain?
Oh, well, basically, the way it works is you take the total weight of the mix of your ice cream that you have purchased in the supermarket, and that is less than half of the. So let's say in a 1 litre tub, 400 and whatever, 120, anyway, 400 and something grams out of the total 1 litre is going to be product. The rest is going to be air. And that's just the way it works. And that's how you get cheap ice cream at the supermarket, because if they didn't have that much air, it would cost you a lot more, which is why my product costs a lot more than, Blue Ribbon and Buller for people who live in Australia, because, less air means the more expensive product. So that's basically it. If you want to test it out, just measure weigh the tub of ice cream you've purchased, and you'll see that 1 litre of ice cream does not weigh 1 kilo, okay? And it will weigh 400 and something grams. But they don't put the weight of the tub on the pack. They only put the volume. They put the weight size per serve, but then you have to multiply that by the number of serves to get the weight, but you can measure that for yourself. So I'm telling you, if you weigh the tub, you'll see that it is significantly less than 1 kilo. Interestingly, there was a TikTok video where this girl did this whole thing on screen and went nuts. It went viral because people, just like all of you, could not believe that they're paying for air when they buy their ice cream. It's not all bad because the price is low and you're eating less calories. So, and the mouthfeel is fantastic. Product with high air in it has a beautiful mouthfeel. So it's not all downside.
No.
But you have to understand what you're buying.
Well, also someone in the chat room, and this is a very skeptical joke, has suggested that there's some high percentage air ice cream would be really, really suitable for breatharians.
What's a breatharian?
Oh, breatharian it's a pseudoscience where the claimed ability is for a person to live without consuming food.
Oh.
So they exist on air. So they could do it.
Well, that's an enjoyable way to have air. Very enjoyable.
Yes. Okay. So we do have some more questions. So a question about the homogenization process and whether there are any particular special techniques at factory level.
We use a homogenizer, which is basically a series of plates. It's the same as in the dairy industry. It's the same equipment. It's a series of plates with tiny little holes, and the product comes in under pressure and gets pushed through these minuscule holes. I don't even know how many microns, but it'd be very more, maybe 5-6 micron holes. And as it gets pushed through, the fats and the proteins just get smashed, literally, and then they come back together. So it's a pump. It's like a massive pump. It pumps in. You can't even see what's going on because it's all inside, because obviously it goes in under high pressure, so it's got to be very well contained. But it literally goes through a series of layers of metal with holes, and it comes out the other end, and it goes into an aging tank. And obviously you don't visibly see anything different, but it has been smashed to smithereens.
Great.
I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, well, the question was, what's the technique at factory level?
Yeah.
Okay, so now a question about recipes.
Yes.
Alcohol in ice cream. Does
Yes.
that work?
Absolutely. But alcohol substantially lowers the freezing point. It's got a 6 times greater impact than sugar on freezing point. So that's why, for example, vodka doesn't freeze in the freezer because, again, the alcohol is so effective at making those water molecules not find each other. It just, I don't actually know the structure of alcohol, but it just obviously wraps around the water. And so it cannot form a structure. So in ice cream, if you use too much, you end up with this mushy mess which never freezes. So you have to be very careful. And in fact, when you do an alcohol-based ice cream, which is fun, you have to use a special sugar that doesn't actually lower the freezing point because the alcohol is doing that for you. And so if you have the sugar as well, then it's going to be too mushy. You won't taste the alcohol and you won't have enough sugar. So you adjust with some very special sugars that do some very clever things, and they're sweet, but they don't impact freezing point because the alcohol is doing that for you and making it softer.
Right.
So yes, absolutely. No, I've made lots of alcohol-based ice cream.
Rum and raisin?
Rum with chocolate is sensational. Whiskey with vanilla is unbelievable. There's some really great pairings. Look, you can't do it commercially because in a supermarket you can't sell alcohol without a license. So all you get is 1% alcohol. So in Australia, a very famous flavour is rum and raisin. And we're looking at doing that at some point. But you don't get much alcohol in it because you can't do that. Unless you sell it in the bottle shop where there's alcohol, you absolutely cannot do it. Plus, structurally, it's challenging to use a lot of alcohol in terms of taste and sugars. It's at the most you can ever use is 5% anyway, and that's only for a gelato that you're going to eat the next day. It just doesn't have good long shelf life. So generally 1 to 2% you can still get good shelf life out of, but if it's more than 1%, you can't sell it in a supermarket anyway.
Well, so I think we've come to the end of our questions. So thank you on behalf of Australian Skeptics to Roz, and on behalf of our audience. Great presentation. And yes, in terms of the recipe, of course, Roz, this talk has been recorded as we talked about. So we can go back to the recipe anytime and jot it down and try it out and let you know how we go.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. So everybody, see you next month. I think it is going to be Thursday the 4th of August for our next Skeptics in the Pub. So keep an eye out and we'll let you know who the speaker will be then. Okay, good night.